There are moments in history where scale becomes almost meaningless, where numbers lose their usual power and something else takes over. April 26th, 1916 was one of those moments. In Dublin, at the southern end of Mount Street Lower, where it meets the Grand Canal, a quiet stretch of road and stone suddenly became one of the most brutal and lopsided battlefields of the Easter Rising. What unfolded there was not a sweeping clash of armies, but a slow, grinding confrontation between a handful of determined defenders and a force that seemed overwhelming by comparison. But to understand how such a small group could have had such a massive impact, we need to step back just a couple of days earlier. On Easter Monday, April 24th of 1916, the Easter Rising began. English Irish volunteers and members of the Irish Citizen Army moved into key positions across Dublin. They were seizing buildings and attempting to disrupt the British control. Among them was a contingent led by Imon de Valeria. I know I'm butchering these names, but please forgive me. But Amon took up a position in Boland's Bakery. From there, smaller groups were sent out with specific objectives, one of which would lead directly to Mount Street Bridge. A group of 17 volunteers was tasked with a mission that sounded simple, but it carried an enormous risk. Their objective was to delay British reinforcements expected to land at Ligonier. I do not speak Irish, I'm sorry, and advance into the city. They were not told to win a battle. They were told to slow one down. That distinction matters because it shaped everything that followed. These men were not prepared for decisive victory. They were preparing to hold, resist, and to make every minute count. They were also preparing to die. They spread out across a small cluster of buildings overlooking the road and the bridge. At 25 Northumberland Road, a few volunteers took position, though two of them were sent home because they were too young. They didn't want to send children to do this. Others occupied Parochial Hill, while 7 held Clanwilliam House, and 2 more positioned themselves in a nearby schoolhouse. It was not a fortress or a unified defensive line. This was a scattered arrangement of strong points, each one covering a different angle, each one contributing to a larger plan that relied on coordination and discipline, things that uprisings usually don't have. Then came the information that would test their plan. On April 26th, the dispatcher arrived with urgent news. Nearly 2,000 British soldiers had landed and were advancing toward their position. Among them was the Robin Hood Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters, a well-trained and organized force. For the 17 volunteers, this was not unexpected, but the sheer scale of what was coming could not be ignored. The difference in numbers was staggering, and yet the positions had already been chosen. There was no turning back. 17 against 2,000. The British forces approached with the expectation of resistance, but not the kind they encountered. As they advanced along the road, they came under fire from positions they couldn't immediately identify. Shots rang out from buildings, from windows, from angles that forced them into the open. What should have been a straightforward advance quickly became disjointed and seriously dangerous. Soldiers found themselves exposed, unsure of where the next shot would be coming from, and unable to move forward without taking losses. The first major obstacle came at 25 Northumberland Road. 2 volunteers inside held their positions against repeated attempts to dislodge them. It took the British hours of sustained effort to finally clear that one building. Hours. That detail alone begins to reveal the nature of this battle. It was not a rapid engagement. It was a slow, punishing struggle where every position had to be taken at a cost. Meanwhile, the other volunteer positions continued to fire on advancing troops. From Clanwilliam House, from the Parochial Hall, from the schoolhouse. All these shots were coming from multiple directions, carrying a layered defense that magnified the effectiveness of each individual fighter. The British soldiers were trained, they were disciplined and numerous, but they were forced to move through a narrow space where every step forward placed them at risk. And this is where the story shifts in a way that changes how we understand what happened. This was not simply a case of a small group holding out against overwhelming odds through sheer bravery alone. The volunteers had chosen their positions with precision. They used the layout of the streets, the cover of the buildings, and the predictable movement of the advancing force to their advantage. The road funneled the British troops into a confined area, while the buildings provided protection and clear lines of sight for the defenders. What looked like a desperate stand was, in reality, a carefully constructed defensive setup that turned the environment itself into a force multiplier. For 9 hours, this dynamic held. 9 hours of advancing, retreating, regrouping, attempting again. 9 hours where time itself became a weapon in the hands of the volunteers. Every delay, every pause, every moment of hesitation contributed to their objective. They were not trying to eliminate the entire British force. They were trying to slow it down, and in that they succeeded in a way that exceeded all expectations. By the time the battle ended, the costs were severe. The Sherwood Foresters suffered 216 casualties, including 28 dead. For a single engagement during the uprising, this was one of the highest losses experienced by British forces. The volunteers, by comparison, lost 4 men by the names of Dick Murphy, George Reynolds, Michael Malone, and Patrick Doyle. They were all killed in action. Their numbers were small, but their impact was undeniable. Eventually, the British forces did secure the area. The positions were taken, the resistance was overcome, and the advance continued. But the time lost, the casualties sustained, and the disruption caused by those 17 men had already altered the course of events in Dublin. Reinforcements that were meant to move quickly were delayed. Momentum that should have maintained was interrupted. What makes this battle so striking is not just the disparity in numbers, but the way those numbers were rendered less important simply by strategy, positioning, and execution. It challenges the assumption that larger forces will always prevail quickly and decisively. It shows that under the right conditions, a smaller group can absolutely exert influence far greater than its size. It also raises deeper questions about how we measure success in conflict. The volunteers did not hold the bridge indefinitely. They did not stop the British advancement entirely, but they did achieve their objective. They delayed, they disrupted. They forced a much larger force to pay a heavy price for progress that might otherwise have come easily. History often focuses on the outcomes, on who ultimately held their ground or claimed a victory. But moments like this remind us that impact is not always measured in final control. Sometimes it's measured in time gained, in costs imposed, and in the way a single engagement can ripple outward into larger events. So here's a question that I want you to take a moment to think about and then answer in the comments. When you look at battles like this, with the overwhelming odds and the overwhelming numbers, do you think success is defined by who wins in the end or by what is accomplished along the way? And of course, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.